Imagine being a child, torn from your parents, starved, worked until your tiny hands bled, all under the guise of salvation. In Victorian England, this was no nightmare. It was reality. Workhouses promised rescue from poverty, but for thousands of children, they became prisons of hunger, despair, and early graves. This is the dark fate of children in Victorian workhouses. This was not childhood. This was survival in its most grotesque form. The Victorian workhouse, a place built under the guise of salvation, but in reality, an institution of quiet extermination. The story of the children who lived and died within these walls begins not with their innocence, but with their disposability. England in the 19th century was a land torn by contradictions. At its heart, it was an empire of progress. Steam engines shrieking through the countryside, factories vomiting smoke into the skies, wealth accumulating in the pockets of merchants and aristocrats. But beneath this industrial marvel was a shadow that few dared to look upon: the masses of the poor. Among them, children were the most vulnerable. Orphans left behind by cholera outbreaks, sons and daughters of men crushed in coal mines, infants abandoned by mothers who could no longer feed them. For these children, the workhouse was not a choice. It was a sentence. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 promised relief for the destitute, but this relief came with conditions so brutal they could barely be called human. Families who entered a workhouse were torn apart, husbands separated from wives, mothers wrenched away from their children. For the authorities, it was a matter of efficiency. For the children, it was trauma without end. Imagine being 5 years old, taken by strangers into a cavernous brick building, its high barred windows blocking out the sky. Imagine your mother's hand slipping from yours as way. Ardens drag her in another direction. The sound of her voice fades, and you never see her again. For many children, this was the very first memory of the workhouse. Separation, abandonment, the kind that scars the mind forever. Inside, their days were not filled with play, but with punishment disguised as labor. The boys were sent to pick oakum, tarred rope pulled apart strand by strand until their small fingers bled raw. Girls were ordered to scrub endless floors with water so cold it burned, their knees bruised from hours of crawling across stone. The littlest ones, barely able to stand, were confined to nurseries that were nothing more than holding pens, where disease ran rampant and silence was enforced by the whip. And always, there was hunger. Workhouse rations were deliberately meager, designed to be worse than what the poorest could find outside, so that only the truly desperate would enter. Thin porridge, stale bread, perhaps a morsel of cheese. Children gnawed at crusts with the intensity of starved animals. Malnutrition warped their growth, left their bones fragile, their eyes sunken. To look at a workhouse child was to look at a ghost in the making. But cruelty in the workhouse was not only physical, it was psychological, systematic, designed to break the spirit. Officials believed poverty was a moral failing, and so the children were treated as sinners in need of correction. Discipline was harsh, often sadistic. A child caught whispering could be beaten. A boy too slow in his labor might be locked in a dark cell. A girl who cried for her mother risked the strap across her back. To Victorian society, this was character building. In truth, it was dehumanization on an industrial scale. And yet, outside the workhouse walls, the same society congratulated itself on its progress. While the rich dined in gas-lit halls, raising glasses of wine to the glory of empire, just a mile away children wasted in cold, overcrowded dormitories. The irony was not lost on those few reformers who dared to look, but for most of England, the suffering of these children was invisible. The workhouse was meant to save them from the streets, but often it delivered them to an even darker fate. Illness spread like wildfire in these cramped, unsanitary spaces. Measles, typhus, whooping cough. In some workhouses, infant mortality reached over 60%. Rows of small graves lined the parish cemeteries, each marked with nothing more than a number. And here lies the bitter truth. For many children, the workhouse was not a place of survival at all. It was a waiting room for death. The candle burns lower. A child coughs again. The sound fades into silence. The narrator's voice returns, lower now, colder. They were told this was rescue. In reality, it was erasure, the quiet destruction of an entire generation. hidden behind brick walls and the respectable mask of Victorian morality. This is the story of the dark fate of children in the workhouses, and it begins with hunger, cruelty, and the breaking of innocence. To understand the workhouse child, we must first understand the ideology that built their prison. The architects of the 1834 Poor Law were not sadists in the literal sense, but their beliefs carried consequences as lethal as any whip. They believed poverty was a moral disease, the result of laziness, drunkenness, vice. To cure this disease, they insisted that conditions for the poor must be less eligible than those of the lowest free laborer. What did that mean in practice? That the workhouse had to be worse than starvation outside. If you entered, it was because you had no other choice. This principle trickled down with ferocious clarity into the lives of children. Their suffering wasn't an accident, it was policy. Each morning, the bell rang at dawn. Children were marched from the dormitories into their assigned wards. Boys and girls separated, siblings forbidden from even speaking to one another. The day began with silence. No chatter, no laughter, only the scraping of spoons against tin bowls. Breakfast was a ladle of watery gruel, its taste as bleak as the stone walls surrounding them. From there, the hours stretched into labor. For boys, it was endless tasks suited for their small, nimble fingers. Oakum picking, nail sorting, bone crushing. Each job designed not to teach skill, but to exhaust. Girls were consigned to laundry, scrubbing mounds of soiled rags until their hands blistered, or sewing uniforms until their eyesight blurred. Little ones too weak to work were sent to the nursery, where neglect festered. The work was not about productivity. It was about punishment. Every aching muscle, every drop of blood from cut fingers, every cough from inhaling dust and rope fibers. These were reminders that poverty was shameful and the poor must suffer for daring to exist. The overseers patrolled constantly. These men and women were not saints of mercy, but wardens of cruelty. Their authority was absolute. They could deny food, administer beatings, impose silence. One whistle, one command, and an entire row of children would freeze in fear. There were stories whispered in corners of punishment so extreme they bordered on torture. A boy who fell asleep at his work tied to a post and left standing all night. A girl caught with a stolen potato forced to wear a placard labeled "Thief" around her neck for days. Fear was the air they breathed. It soaked into their bones, becoming part of their very posture. Shoulders hunched, eyes lowered, voices barely above a whisper. Childhood, that brief window of joy, imagination, and growth, was systematically strangled. Yet perhaps the cruelest irony was how the workhouse clothed its violence in morality. The children were dressed in coarse uniforms meant to erase individuality. They were marched to church services where sermons thundered about virtue, discipline, and God's will. To Victorian society, these were lessons in salvation. To the children, they were chains disguised as hymns. Consider the psychology of a 7-year-old hearing day after day that their hunger was deserved, that their tears were weakness, that their very existence was a burden. For many, the workhouse was not just a place of labor, but a factory of shame. It taught them that they were unworthy of love, unworthy of freedom, unworthy even of life. Disease thrived in these walls. With overcrowded dormitories, damp conditions, and poor food, illnesses swept through like scythes. Tuberculosis, smallpox, diphtheria, names that meant death came quickly. In some wards, so many coffins were carried out that the children began to count them, whispering numbers in the night. Death became both a terror and a release. And yet, the workhouse system endured. Because outside, on the polished floors of Parliament and in the drawing rooms of the wealthy, these institutions were hailed as triumphs of efficiency. They reduced outdoor relief, cut costs, enforced discipline. Statistics looked clean, while reality bled and starved. The rain continues to fall in the courtyard. The camera lingers on a child's hand, raw and cracked from labor, clutching a spoon as if it were a lifeline. The narrator's voice lowers. This was not accident. This was design. The workhouse was not simply a shelter for the poor. It was an experiment in social engineering. And the children, barely old enough to speak in full sentences, were its unwilling test subjects. They were told this was for their betterment. But every stone in those walls carried another truth. It was not salvation they were given, but slow, deliberate suffering. One of the most devastating realities of the workhouse was separation. Families who entered were broken like porcelain dropped on stone. Fathers in one ward, mothers in another, children scattered according to age and gender. For some, the workhouse was the first and last time they saw their parents. Imagine a 6-year-old boy hearing his mother's cries as she was dragged away, only for those sounds to fade behind locked doors. That sound, that ripping away, lived with them forever. For children, the loss was twofold. Not only did they lose their parents' embrace, but they lost any sense of belonging. They became wards of an institution that saw them not as souls, but as statistics. Each child reduced to a number, a ration, a line in the ledger. And yet, in this emptiness, something dangerous began to grow. The workhouse sought to reform, to discipline, to mold these children into compliant members of the laboring poor. But what it often created was despair, and in some, rebellion. The psychological torment was unrelenting. Silence was demanded at all times, smiles were rare, laughter forbidden. Any flicker of childish play was quickly crushed. Punishments ranged from reduced rations to beatings, from solitary confinement to public humiliation. A boy caught hiding a crust of bread might be locked alone in the black hole, a cell so dark and damp that even rats avoided it. A girl accused of insolence could be paraded before the others, her hair shorn as a mark of shame. And yet, despite everything, there were whispers, small rebellions hidden in the cracks. Children stealing scraps from the kitchens, sneaking pebbles into overseers' boots, whispering lullabies in the dead of night when they thought the wardens had gone. Tiny sparks of humanity that refused to be extinguished. But for most, the cruelty left marks that could never be erased. Malnutrition twisted their growth. Labor deformed their hands. Diseases scarred their lungs. Even those who survived the workhouse often emerged broken in body and spirit. Many could not hold steady employment, their health destroyed before adulthood. Some drifted into crime, others into early graves. The workhouse did not cure poverty. It reproduced it, generation after generation. The irony was sickening. A system designed to eliminate dependence instead created lifelong dependency. And the children, those who should have been given tools for growth, were instead handed shackles that followed them long after the workhouse doors closed behind them. There is another layer, one that chills even deeper, the deliberate use of fear as moral instruction. Officials believed terror itself could shape children into obedient citizens, so sermons boomed about hellfire and punishment, overseers preached about sin, and every lash of the whip was framed as divine correction. Poverty was no longer a misfortune. It was a crime. And children, too young to even understand the word poverty, were made to feel like criminals. This theology of cruelty seeped into their very sense of self. Imagine a child who grows up hearing every day that their hunger is proof of their wickedness, that their suffering is deserved, that their pain is a reflection of God's justice. How could such a child ever believe in their own worth? And yet, outside those walls, Victorian society congratulated itself. Reformers published glowing reports about orderly workhouses and rescued children. Inspectors praised the discipline, the cleanliness, the efficiency. What they did not see, or chose not to see, were the hollow eyes staring back at them, the stunted bodies, the graves filling faster than the classrooms. The hypocrisy was staggering. While the empire expanded abroad, conquering lands and peoples in the name of progress, it devoured its own children at home. The workhouse became not a symbol of salvation, but a scar on the very idea of civilization. The workhouse promised order. What it delivered was despair. It sought to raise obedient citizens, but in truth it manufactured ghosts, children stripped of identity, scarred by labor, and haunted by separation. For many, their fates were sealed long before they reached adulthood. And as the 19th century ground forward, the graveyards around these institutions told the story society refused to hear. If the workhouse was a factory of suffering, then the graveyard was its inevitable product. For thousands of children, life within these walls ended not with escape, not with redemption, but with burial. Their deaths were not dramatic. They were quiet, hidden, the kind that slipped unnoticed through the cracks of history. And yet, together, they form one of the darkest chapters of Victorian England. Disease was the workhouse's most efficient executioner. Overcrowding, malnutrition, and squalid sanitation turned these buildings into breeding grounds for contagion. Measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough, names that echo like nursery rhymes twisted into curses. An outbreak could sweep through a children's ward in days, leaving row after row of empty pallets by morning. Doctors were few, medicine scarcer still. Often, children were left to die in isolation, their cries echoing off the stone walls until silence fell. In some institutions, infant mortality soared to nearly 2/3. A mother might enter with a newborn, only to leave weeks later with empty arms. For the authorities, these deaths were regrettable but acceptable. For the children, they were the end of everything before life had even begun. Hunger itself was another killer. Rations were so meager that malnutrition hollowed bodies and dulled minds. Children became skeletal, their bellies distended, their skin papery and pale. Some collapsed during labor, their frail frames unable to withstand the grind. There were accounts, whispered, rarely written, of children gnawing leather scraps, licking stone floors for spilled porridge, even stealing from the dead. And yet, these acts of desperation were treated not with compassion, but with punishment. A child caught scavenging might have their food allowance cut further, a grotesque irony that pushed them closer to death. But death was not the only horror. For those who survived, the future often offered no reprieve. Children were sometimes apprenticed out of the workhouse, a practice touted as charity, as a way to give them skills and independence. In truth, it was often little more than child trafficking under a respectable name. Boys were sent to work in mines or factories, where danger lurked in every machine, every shaft of coal. Girls were dispatched as domestic servants, many falling prey to exploitation and abuse. Once they left the workhouse, few ever returned. Some found themselves in brothels by their teenage years, others in prisons, still wearing the invisible shackles of their upbringing. The workhouse had not freed them. It had merely handed them from one master to another. There is a chilling irony here. Victorian reformers spoke proudly of rescuing children from the streets, of saving them from crime, prostitution, and vice. But the workhouse often delivered them into those very fates. Stripped of family, broken in spirit, unprepared for life beyond labor, these children became easy prey for the darkest corners of society. Even when they survived into adulthood, the scars remained. Many bore chronic illnesses from childhood malnutrition. Others carried psychological wounds, night terrors, distrust, the inability to form close bonds. Entire lives shaped not by possibility, but by trauma inflicted before they could even speak in full sentences. Still, for the Victorian elite, the system was considered a success. Reports praised declining pauper numbers. Ledgers boasted of reduced costs. The reality that thousands of children had died, or lived lives broken beyond repair, was carefully obscured behind the language of efficiency. But not everyone was blind. Some reformers, horrified by what they witnessed, began to speak out. Charles Dickens, once a child forced into labor himself, used his pen to strip away the facade. His novels exposed the cruelty of the poor law system, weaving the suffering of children into unforgettable characters. His words echoed in Parliament, in drawing rooms, in newspapers. He reminded England that behind every statistic was a child, with eyes, with hunger, with pain. And yet, even Dickens' warnings could not undo the years already lost. For countless children, the workhouse was not a stepping stone to life. It was a conveyor belt to the grave. They entered as innocents. They left as bodies, and society called it progress. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cracks began to appear in the facade. Reformers pressed harder, writers exposed more, and the growing conscience of the nation could no longer ignore the cruelty festering in its midst. The introduction of compulsory education, child labor reforms, and eventually the slow dismantling of the workhouse system marked the beginning of change. In 1930, the poor law unions were finally abolished, and the workhouse as an institution was officially consigned to history. Yet the damage had already been done. Generations of children had been ground down by a system that claimed to rescue them, only to destroy them instead. But history has a cruel way of repeating itself. The questions raised by the workhouse still haunt us today. How do we treat the most vulnerable? Do we see poverty as a failing of the individual or a failing of society? And most disturbingly, how often do we disguise cruelty as morality, convincing ourselves that suffering builds character, that deprivation teaches strength? The Victorians believed they were forging disciplined citizens. In truth, they forged graves and ghosts. The legacy of those children lives on not only in records and reform, but in the cautionary tale of what happens when a society values efficiency over compassion, punishment over protection, ideology over humanity. And what of the children themselves? Most left no names behind, only initials in ledgers, marks in parish records, unmarked mounds in crowded cemeteries. But if we close our eyes, we can imagine them still. The boy with raw, bleeding fingers from oakum picking. The girl whose lullabies to her baby brother ended in silence when he never woke. The toddler who reached for his mother's hand and found only air. They are not statistics. They are not footnotes. They were lives, fragile, luminous, extinguished far too soon. There is a bitter irony in the way history remembers Victorian England. We celebrate its progress, the trains, the factories, the empire, the literature. But beneath those achievements lies the shadow of the workhouse. Civilization was built not just on coal and steam, but on the bones of its children. And perhaps that is the truest horror of all. Not the cruelty itself, but the fact that it was justified, normalized, hidden behind walls and sermons and official reports. Respectable society convinced itself it was saving children, even as it starved them. Progress was purchased with silence. The workhouse is gone, but the questions it raises remain. How do we treat those who cannot defend themselves? What cruelties do we still allow to hide behind the mask of necessity? And how many more children, in this century or the next, will be lost to systems that promise salvation, but deliver only suffering? This is the legacy of the Victorian workhouse, not a monument of charity, but a graveyard of innocence.